lives.
Okay, welcome everyone. I hope there are tons of people joining us out in cyberspace. My name is Gretchen Donahauer, and welcome to the first online discussion for the Counting Women's Work project. My name is Gretchen. I'm from UC Berkeley. I am the project director for Counting Women's Work, and we're joined today by four excellent panelists. Nancy Folbray is a professor of economics at University of Massachusetts Amherst, who's been one of the pioneers in studying women's unpaid housework and care work and bringing it into economic analysis and economic awareness. Eliana Rubiano is joining us from the World Bank, unfortunately just by voice. We don't have her picture, but she is an economist with the World Bank's program on gender cross-cutting solutions. Pamela Jimenez is a demographer and the Costa Rica Counting Women's Work researcher in Costa Rica, and she's at the University of Costa Rica and works with the State of the Nation program. Mornay Westhuizen is the project coordinator of Counting Women's Work, my counterpart in South Africa, and South African team member for the project and deputy director of the Development Policy Research Unit at the University of Cape Town. Thank you very much to our panelists for joining us today. So we have two Counting Women's Work researchers on the panel and two outside experts who will discuss their own research and also hopefully help us put our project in the context of research on women's work and unpaid care and housework more broadly. So I'm going to first introduce the project, give a brief review of what we have done, some of our major findings. Then I'll go to Pamela and Mornay to discuss how Counting Women's Work has turned out in their countries and how it's been received and the kinds of discussions with policy audiences and other stakeholders in their countries. And then I'll move to Nancy and Eliana to give a wider perspective on the field. So Counting Women's Work is part of the National Transfer Accounts Project. That's a large international research project with teams in over 50 countries estimating the age dimension of economic activity. So that is to say, we take national aggregates like GDP, total consumption, and disaggregate them by age, because age is one of the most important factors in determining our economic lives. Our economic life is very different when we're children versus working age versus old age. And so that project has helped to reveal how age works in our economies and how when age structures change, how that affects the economy. So gender is another very important factor in determining our economic lives, and we saw that in the National Transfer Accounts Project when we went to add gender as another feature, because then you see that men are doing a lot more market work than women. And so this brings up the critique that has long been made about economic accounts, that they don't include a vast amount of production, and that is unpaid household services. So childcare, cooking, cleaning, elder care, all of these things that have been done, that historically have been considered women's work, have been done in the household for no pay, mostly by women. And so, as I said, this has been a long-standing critique of measures like GDP, that they don't include this economic activity. And so there's a long literature and people using time use surveys to understand this work. So I have a time use survey, I figure out how much time people are spending doing housework and care work, and I value that at a market wage to get a comparable estimate to add to GDP. So Counting Women's Work was sort of born out of taking that research and moving forward with a couple important features. And we were able to do this when we formed the project, and we are the grateful beneficiaries of a grant from the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation and the International Development Research Center in Canada. And we have developed our methodology to extend those unpaid work estimates, which have shown us that unpaid work can contribute anywhere from, say, 25 to 60% in addition to traditionally measured GDP, depending on the methodology and depending on the country. So we extend that with the NTA perspective of disaggregating that by age, because so much of the unpaid housework is driven by demographic phenomena such as childbearing and child raising, and also for elder care, when the age structure of when you will need that. And then we also add the additional national transfer account feature of not just focusing on production, but then having the estimates of consumption. So we have by age how much unpaid care time and housework time is being produced, and then by age how it is being consumed. So the biggest thing that we have learned doing this in many different countries across the world, counting women's work so far is mostly focused on developing countries, but we also have estimates from the US and comparative estimates from Europe that we are spending a lot more on our children in terms of unpaid time than we are in terms of goods and services. So this is a very important result from the project, because there is a lot of economic analysis that is about dependency, the costs of child dependency. So when the costs of child dependency only include market goods and services, that is very incomplete. And the other part that Counting Women's Work brings to the literature on unpaid care and housework is that our estimates pair seamlessly with the market estimates of traditional national transfer accounts. So those of you who got the detailed flyer for the event can see on the back of that flyer estimates for Mexico for the national transfer accounts, market accounts, and then the national time transfer accounts, household production. And those fit together, and then you get a total economy picture, which is very different than either of those sectors separately. So what are the policy relevance, the aspects of policy relevance here? Well, one of them certainly is monitoring inequality. So where do we see in different countries across the project differential access to opportunities for market work, opportunities for education, or access to leisure time? And I haven't really emphasized that because most of what we work with are the monetary accounts, but we also add up everything in just time units. So there, our estimates can address issues of differential access to leisure. But we also can use our estimates for policy areas where there's any kind of policy that crosses the market and household border. So if you're trying to increase women's labor force supplies, say, then you also need to understand how the time that they're spending on housework and childcare could possibly be a barrier to increased market work. And then our estimates allow you to have an order of magnitude about how much time you're going to need to help out with. Or in different contexts, if there is a lot of unpaid time being spent on things like carrying water and fetching wood, that in that context, the solution to lower the household barrier to market work is a technological solution. So our estimates are able to address policy issues in that way. Let's see what else. Demographic dividends are also an incredibly popular topic right now in policy circles and development as well. And demographic dividend arguments are all about the costs of dependency. So one of the things that our project is working on now is basically reformulating the demographic dividend analysis to include the costs of time. And so what comes out of that is that really, if the demographic dividend argument is about returns to fertility reduction, those are even greater when you consider the time you are freeing up, not just the market goods and services that you are freeing up. So in terms of incentives to try to capitalize on demographic dividends, our estimates make the policy implications there even stronger. So that was a whirlwind introduction to counting women's work. Hopefully you stayed with me during that. But now to make things more specific, I would like to turn to Pamela. First, Pamela, if you could tell us a bit about how things have gone with your research in Costa Rica, what the interest is of the people you're talking to about, and what policy questions people are talking about that our work relates to.
Thank you, Gretchen. The team in Costa Rica for several years now has been trying to bring policymakers closer to our studies and to our main results. Specifically for the Counting Women's Work project, we've been trying not to limit ourselves to consider ourselves as being just producers of scientific evidence. We also start to consider our work as an input for policymakers. So in order to do this, publics that are being implemented in the country, discuss in the national agenda and relate these policies with the work that we've been doing. For example, we use the Counting Women's Work results to show how childcare is a barrier for women to increase their participation in the labor market, especially considering that in Costa Rica, the female labor force participation is under 50%. But we're not just saying that childcare is a barrier. We show policymakers how much time at different ages women spend on childcare and the big imbalance in the distribution between the household members. Therefore, I think we're giving policymakers inputs to strengthen the discussion of public policies. In some cases, our results can be used to support some public policies. In other cases, our results can be warnings or alerts in order to restate or reformulate policies. For example, recently some policymakers in Costa Rica consider that employment policies should be directed towards men. But our results show that the potential opportunity to increase the female labor force participation is with women. In other words, what I'm trying to explain is that we translate our results as inputs for policymakers without a specific political bias. So this step that is going from the academia to policy has been successful to connect us with policymakers. For example, the Ministry for Women in Costa Rica have used our results as an input to have a better understanding of gender inequality. Specifically because we give them a new outlook that they didn't have before, and is a demographic perspective of gender inequality. Another important link with policymakers has been through the State of the Nation program. The State of the Nation program is a research center that belongs to the Public Universities Council of Costa Rica. And every year, this center publishes a report of the State of the Nation. And this report is widely used and quoted by policymakers. So the Counting Women's Work result have been used as part of the analysis in the social equity chapter. So at this point, I will say that we have a good relationship with several key policy actors. For example, the Ministry for Women, the General Controller, the State of the Nation program. We've organized seminars together, and I've been invited to some other conference to present some Counting Women's Work results. But it's important to acknowledge that this relationship, this good relationship, didn't come up suddenly. On the contrary, is the result of several years of work. For example, with the Ministry for Women, we started a couple of years ago inviting them to our conference, to our workshops, to our brown bags. But we didn't send them a general invitation. We try to have a personalized relationship with them. We personally invite them in order to them to be more interested in our work. Also, during our meetings, as I mentioned, we try to relate policies with our results, and we give them new scientific evidence to strengthen their policies. For example, daycare networks, co-responsibility programs, parental leave, which is now being discussed a lot in Costa Rica. Regarding what you mentioned regarding questions and feedback that we've been getting, some of the questions or feedback are like doing simulations of what happened if we increase female labor force participation, or what happened if we increase the coverage of daycare networks. So we pay a lot of attention to some request evaluations. So I think that would get us closer to policymakers because we're trying to fill some of their needs. Some other questions that we have been asked, for example, to disaggregate the analysis more in elderly care or by state or by race. But sometimes we're very limited with the information that we have right now. However, an important step related to policy is that the Ministry for Women is starting the process of building a new time use survey. And they've asked us to be part of this process, and we're going to be part of the evaluation meeting in order to give some feedback of this new time survey. So I think this link with policymakers is very important because right now, for example, we have been included in this important process, which is the new national time and the first national time use survey that is going to be constructed in Costa Rica.
Okay, that is, thank you very much, Pamela. That is terrific. I had not heard about the new time use survey, so congratulations. I also, at the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women, I remember seeing a tweet from the Costa Rican head of state about the need to recognize unpaid work. So I thought, good work, Pamela, all the way up to the United Nations. And I'm also to remind everyone to please, if you have questions that you'd like to put to the panelists, type them into the comment section of the YouTube channel where this is playing, and then I can ask the panelists once we get to Q&A period. Okay, I would like to turn to Mornay now, please, to hear about what's going on in South Africa. Mornay.
Great, thanks very much. Yeah, so I think maybe just to give a little bit of background in terms of where South Africa is in terms of this research. Certainly in South Africa at the institutional and at the policy level, there's been quite a strong emphasis in terms of gender equality and improving access for women, whether it be in terms of education, whether it be in terms of employment and so on. And so we do see in specific areas there's been quite a lot of progress. So we see, for example, that girls are starting to outperform boys in terms of educational attainment. And we see, for example, that South Africa ranks quite highly when we look at number of women in parliament and the number of women in ministerial positions and that type of thing. But what we find is that in practice and at sort of a more micro level, we still face significant challenges. So women's access to employment is still constrained. All things equal, they are less likely than men to be employed, for example. They also earn, on average, less than their male counterparts, even with the same characteristics. And what we do find in certain sections of the population, and to varying degrees, we find that there's still some strong views on what is considered men's work and what is considered women's work. And that extends in terms of non-market work or household production, but even in some areas of market work, there is still this kind of idea of what is appropriate and what is not appropriate. And sort of as a background to this context, I think a lot of people will know that South Africa faces significant unemployment. The unemployment rate is around about 24%, but if we look for young people, it's about 50%. So we have this big burden of unemployment in South Africa. We also find the burden of HIV/AIDS. A lot of the care for sick people falls to women. We find that the pandemic has been hollowing out the prime working age cohort. And we find that it creates increases the incidence of this phenomenon of skip generation households, where the elderly are taking care of their orphan grandchildren. And this has important implications in terms of women and what they are required or what they're expected to do. And then we also find that South Africa, like many other developing countries, is undergoing significant societal changes. So in terms of the demographic dividend, the country is going through a demographic dividend, and we expect the old age population to grow very rapidly over the next 35 years. We also find that, as Pamela was speaking about labour force participation in South Africa, labour force participation rate for women is only 52% compared to 65% for men. So there's this very big difference in terms of participation in the labour market. And so I think in terms of where we are in the research and what we've been finding in the Counting Women's Work research is this really a reconfirmation of the reality that women are responsible for a significant proportion of total work in the country. And I think what's important from that perspective is that it becomes very hard, once you've put a number to it, it becomes hard to dismiss. I think what often happens is you can say, oh, women are contributing a lot to the economy, or they're contributing half to the economy, or whatever the case might be. But once we start putting numbers to it, it becomes very difficult for people to sort of ignore this type of issue. So I think that's been quite important for us, is to start putting numbers. I mean, this kind of assessing the proportion of total production accounted for by women has been done in South Africa before, but this obviously is an update in terms of those numbers. But I think where Counting Women's Work is really has been really useful, and where it gains quite a lot of traction, is the differentiation across the life cycle. So this idea that we can actually look at different ages, and we get a much better feel for what is going on at different stages in the life cycle. And so one of the big things that we find in South Africa, and I think it's true in most of the countries, if not all the countries that have done this work, is that women are spending more time in productive activities in total than men do. So if we're taking market production and household production, we're adding those two things together, women spend more time in those activities. And what we're finding in our research is that this is true across the life cycle. So women women and girls, so from the age of 10 all the way through the life cycle, they are spending more time in productive activities than men. And importantly, what we're finding is that for girls, the difference is quite substantial. So girls at the age of 14 are spending 2 hours a day in household production on average, and by age 17, they're spending 3 hours a day. And so this has very important implications for girls' education, especially given the fact that when you look at market production between boys and girls at those ages, it's very similar. So there's not a big difference in market production, but there's quite a big difference in terms of household production. And what has been quite interesting as well is to sort of gauge where South Africa is in comparison with other countries. And so we see, for example, that girls are generating time surpluses, so they are producing more in terms of household production than they're consuming. They start generating surpluses at age 14, which when you compare it to other countries is about 5 to 10 years earlier than girls or women in other countries. So it's already at a very young age, girls are producing surpluses. And I think importantly, the Counting Women's Work research speaks to sort of the issue of equitable employment, equitable access to employment for men and for women, and for equal opportunities for men and for women to utilize their educations. So I think this idea that we spend a huge amount in terms of education and we're chasing targets in terms of getting parity in terms of enrollment rates and that type of thing is only, I think we're missing out on a lot of the benefit if we are constraining women's access to employment. And we're saying because of the differential time burdens, we're not sort of utilizing that education within the economy. And I think that has implications at a societal level, but obviously it has implications at a household and an individual level as well. And then in terms of sort of our interaction with the policy community, so we are a little bit behind Costa Rica in terms of sort of the effort to reach policymakers. The one really great thing for our research was that last year we were able to include some of the early results in the Status of the Woman report. So our Department of Women has had a sort of their flagship publication last year was on the status of women in the South African economy, and we were able to include a chapter that looked at the results coming out of the Counting Women's Work research, and that has been really well received, and we've had some really good feedback in terms of that. And I think what we've experienced in terms of the Counting Women's Work research, but also applicable to the sort of the general NTA research, is that there really is a lot of interest that's sort of stimulated by the addition of the life cycle dimension. So this idea of looking at different ages and different phases of the life cycle and understanding what are the pressures and so on for each group. And I think what we're finding is that a lot of the results are sort of confirming what would previously be anecdotal evidence. So we sort of know as a society that this is how things are working, but we often don't really have the evidence to back those kind of anecdotes up. And what we're finding is that the Counting Women's Work estimates are aligning to these anecdotal pieces of evidence, which I think is encouraging, and it's also really useful in terms of backing up those anecdotes so that they're not just anecdotes anymore. So I think the one big thing from a policy perspective really is in terms of the way that we interpret the results for policy. One of the examples in South Africa, for example, is that on average, men are spending 5 minutes per day in childcare, compared to 29 minutes a day for women. And so your sort of first reaction is that, oh, we need to change attitudes so that men are taking on a bigger share of childcare. But if we look at adults that are co-resident with their own children under the age of 7, we see that there's a big gap between men and women. So 72% of women engage in the care of persons compared to just 27% of men. But if we sort of dig deeper into that data, we really see that at least a significant proportion of this difference is really driven, of this difference between the 5 minutes and the 29 minutes is driven by lower proportions of men that are co-resident with children. And so when we look at especially sort of the 18 to 40 year category of adults, we see that only 64% of men are co-resident with children under 14, as opposed to 78% of women. So there is this really big difference in co-residence with children. And so that sort of points to different impacts of policy and sort of different policy recommendations in terms of remedying or improving equality in terms of the burden of childcare. So really this low time on average is really an outcome of low participation rates combined with with short time allocations to care. And I think that's one of the really important things, is sort of to, once we have the estimates, is to start looking deeper into what is driving some of these estimates. I mean, I think working with the averages is really useful, but when we work with averages, we do need to be quite careful in terms of how we interpret that from a policy perspective. And I think that's something that we'll come up against quite a lot, given sort of the very big inequalities within South African society. So yeah, thanks.
All right, thank you very much. And that's a good, having Costa Rica and South Africa following each other is a good contrast as well, because I think there you see how the project as a whole is working to do everything on a cross-national comparative basis, but when we get down to the level of actual policy interactions, it's very contextual, it's very different from each country to country. So, I mean, the cross-country comparative and the very much more localized have their strengths and weaknesses, but it's definitely different focus at those different levels. So now I would like to move to Nancy Fulbray. Nancy, if you want to react to what you've heard the three of us say so far, and also discuss the research that you shared with me last week that you're working on, which is about widening the definition of care. And when we're thinking about the policy discussion, we'll also have really different kind of policy messages. So I'll turn it over to you, Nancy.
Oh, thank you so much. It's really great to be a part of this conversation. And I hope it's the first of many, because it's such an exciting project, putting together both time and money, and really trying to integrate it within the larger picture of the economy. So mostly I'm just really excited that things are moving forward on so many different fronts. It's great. A lot of my research has focused on time use in the US, and there are two time use surveys in the US that have several different measures of childcare. The American Time Use Survey asks respondents not just about activities of care, but also about supervisory responsibility. And there's also a child development supplement of the panel study of income dynamics. And what my research has shown, looking at these data sets, is that supervisory time, especially for young children, is quantitatively quite significant. And it's a major constraint on women's time that's not necessarily captured by the activity measures in standard time use surveys. So childcare as an activity is something like feeding, clothing, playing with, bathing. But a lot of childcare time involves just being present or on call while possibly doing something else, relaxing with friends or doing housework. And by the way, this is also true for elder care and for care of severely ill or disabled family members, like those with HIV. There's not a lot you can actually do to take care of somebody who is sick physically. A lot of what is involved is being available, being there if they need you, being able to respond to them when they need a sip of water or when they need the bed sheets changed. So I really want to emphasize in this discussion and debate that it's really important, especially with care time, to improve our measures, and also to compare the way that activities are being designated in existing surveys. Because even a small change in wording affects the likelihood that someone will report a supervisory activity as a care activity. And I think it's a really interesting and important kind of dimension of the measurement challenge. And now that we have more time use surveys going into the field, I think it's a really great time to increase awareness of that issue. I think I also have a couple of theoretical issues I want to throw out kind of briefly. One is, I think that one of the great advantages of combining the transfers of of money and transfers of time is that you can actually look at the distribution of the costs of caring for dependents between men and women and between different groups in society. And I think that is a really interesting question, not just what is the dependency burden, is the dependency burden getting bigger or smaller, but what proportion of the dependency burden is being borne by men and women, and what proportion is being borne by families, and what proportion by the state. So I think that kind of speaks to a larger political economy of care that could really become an important part of this approach. There's also the potential to look at measures of extended income on the household level, which could change our picture of income inequality. Households with a stay-at-home parent working full-time have a higher standard of living than other households with the same market income. And I think we need to really pay attention to that as we develop better measures of family income inequality. And then finally, on the macro level, it's not just that we need to get the value of transfers and unpaid work into the accounts. It's also that we need to think about which components of these represent investment rather than consumption. Because I think the tendency is still to see it as a form of consumption. Even though we use this metaphor of human capital, we don't really think of time devoted to children as an investment. But if you're really serious about the human capital concept, you have to recognize that family time is and should be classified as investment, or at least many components of it should be. So I think there are all these great connections with economic theory and current debates and micro and macro that we need to really push on.
All right, thank you very much, Nancy. Yeah, and hopefully what we are building is kind of a database that will allow things like the quantity-quality trade-off analysis to include time in a more seamless way than it's been possible to before. I've worked on that with a colleague who works on the accounts in European countries. And yeah, and the investment piece is also, thank you for bringing that up as well, because when we're thinking about dependency, people are often sort of saying that the old age dependency and young age dependency are kind of just they're just different kinds of the same thing. But when you think about it in terms of investment, they are completely different. One is investment and one is much more consumption. Okay, so I would like to now turn to Eliana Rubiano, who is part of the World Bank's effort on gender cross-cutting solutions. So Eliana, I know that you said you're just getting started with the project about around care and unpaid work at the World Bank. So if you wanted to tell us a bit about that and how you see that relating to the work that we've been talking about so far today, that would be terrific.
Great. Thank you so much, Gretchen. Can you properly hear me? Hello?
Yes.
Absolutely. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So let me tell you a little bit more about the context and the importance of care for the World Bank. So last December, the World Bank Group launched its new gender strategy, which builds on 4 pillars. The first one, addressing remaining gaps in human endowments, that is education and health. The second one is addressing remaining constraints to more and better jobs. Third one, removing barriers to ownership and control over assets. And the fourth one is enhancing voice and agency and engaging men and boys. So improving access to more and better jobs, it's for us one of the key pillars in these strategies, if not one of the most important ones, to say the least. We know for sure that providing women with access to care services is one of the key aspects to considering in terms of policy. It is well documented. We have evidence that childcare duties fall disproportionately on women of all ages, as you have been saying. In the case of elder care, same thing, while filial obligation might rest let's say, equally on daughters and sons. We also know that those more likely to act upon it are daughters and also daughters-in-law. So the burden of elder care and childcare responsibilities, we know that can have serious negative repercussions on women's economic outcomes. This will in turn lead to increased vulnerability and might also exacerbate gender-based inequalities. You know that as women spend more time engaging in unpaid informal care work, they have less time to work in the market. So we believe that providing care has an intrinsic economic value as well. It helps this generation work in the jobs they want. And in the case of children, as Nancy was mentioning, it provides a direct input into the production of the next generation of workers. So it's also the generation of human capital. So for women to engage in paid employment, care work will need to be redistributed within the households between adult male and adult female members and between households and private and public providers. So from a policy perspective, we believe that if care demands are addressed by appropriate policy interventions, there will be an opportunity to increase labor force participation as well as productivity, especially for women. And this will be vital for our twin goals of reducing extreme poverty, eliminating extreme poverty, and also boosting shared prosperity. The project we're starting to work on, we're basically trying to compile evidence on time use decisions at the individual level and put together the evidence that exists for the different developing countries. There is a lot of evidence for developed countries, but not much for the low and middle income ones. So we want to put together all those things as a first step. And then we also would like to put together an analysis of family policies across developing countries around the dimensions of institutional arrangements for the provision of care, as well as financing, coverage, and, if possible, quality. As you mentioned, we're still in the early stages of this project, but hopefully things will go this way.
Thank you very much for letting us in on that. It's so I think actually that leads into one of the first questions that I wanted to sort of put to the panel. I think any of us working in this field, I mean, the ideas behind the Counting Women's Work project go back something like 5 years, but it seems like in this past year, now every week there is a new article from some high-profile person on care, the millennial or sustainable development goals have several explicitly stated points about unpaid care and women's work. There's just a lot of interest out there in the news, and I mean, in the World Bank has now made this a focus. And so I guess the question would be sort of why now? So I wonder if maybe I could start with Nancy on that to ask, have you also, do you see the same kind of all of a sudden explosion in interest in unpaid care work, and why do you think that's happening now?
That is a really great question, and I guess I would qualify your observation a little bit. I agree that there's been a surge in recent years, but if you look back historically, there have been previous little spikes in interest and demands around these issues. Like in the late 19th century U.S., there was a group of women professionals who demanded that the U.S. Census assign a value to market work. Margaret Reed's work in the 1930s sparked a lot of interest in this issue. It sort of came up in the 80s, and then it kind of fizzled out. But I think what's different now is that there is a lot of collective energy and effort from women's organizations behind it, and that it's very connected. The ability to get statistical agencies to pay attention to it is very connected to a kind of mobilization of women that's had this really interesting international dimension. That the United Nations has been a really important arena for this. It's kind of an international coalition, and I think it's very interesting from the point of view of the sociology of knowledge to see how accounting categories themselves are contested by groups who recognize the relevance to policies that will affect their daily lives. So I think that's what we're living through, and it's a really fascinating process.
Yeah, and you know, oh, sorry, there's a little feedback there, but yeah, and when we think about the project and its sort of very specific policy goals, sometimes the focus can get too tight, because when we started the project, part of the whole benefit that we hope to get out of it is to become part of this conversation that makes this invisible economy visible. I mean, it's not invisible to anyone in their household cleaning up after breakfast, but it is invisible in a global economy kind of sense. So, you know, definitely on that sort of harder to specify work of just making this kind of work visible, you know, it's good to be part of that effort, and it does seem like years of other people's work is really coming to a head. So I will, does anybody else want to comment on that, sort of why now? So I think you just unmute yourself and jump in.
Yes, Gretchen, this is Eliana. So I also wanted to mention that population aging in some countries and recent major health crises, especially HIV and AIDS in other countries, have also identified the need for care services. In many developing countries where public health systems have been weakened during the decades of market-oriented reform, much of the care burden has fallen back on women and girls. So I think this is also another reason why much of the attention is being focused on care at this point.
Hi. So I wanted to comment that in the case of Costa Rica, I think there are several factors that I will say that it's bringing the topic to the agenda. One is, as I think Eliana mentioned, Costa Rica is starting the aging process, and people are discussing who is going to take care of all this growing elderly population. So now people are taking care of the kids right now, and so we see all these women that are taking care of the kids that can be working, and that they're increasing participation in the labor market can help to reduce some of the negative impact of the aging process. People are saying, and I think this is very related with what Nancy was mentioning, these women are taking care of kids, and this is an investment for the country. We're investing in human capital. But these women, they don't have, they're not saving, they are not part of a pension system. So part of the policy that people are discussing is we should give them some type of pension or include them in part of our pension system. So because they are working, but their work is unpaid. So how can we pay them in some way? And I think that part of the pension is very important, because a lot of these women are taking care of kids. In the future, they're going to take care of elderly, and then when the kid grows, they are not working anymore, but they are not going to have any pension.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Pamela, because we are getting some questions coming in, and one of them was about that, you know, we've thus far had several times where we were talking about policies that would reduce the household work burden because it was a barrier to labor force participation, but you can completely reformulate the question, as you were just saying, that wait, we're trying to recognize the work that is being done, and to actually, if we recognize this fully as work, it should earn pension credits, it should earn unemployment benefits, it should be recognized as work and protected the same way market work has been. So yeah, certainly when what I see, there's not that much focus on that, but that's a big part of the message of making this visible, and in measuring it, trying to increase its legitimacy as much as work as going to a factory or farming or anything like that. And I think I interrupted Mornay when he was about to comment, so please go ahead.
Yeah, so I just really wanted to make one observation. I mean, I think in South Africa, we've also, one of the big changes that's happened is we've gone to a very much more rights-based approach to things. So since '94, we've had a new constitution, and the constitution obviously guarantees equal rights for men and for women and for boys and girls and so on. But I think, just to put that in context, I mean, as I understand it, in the 80s, for example, we still had different tax rates for married as opposed to single women. So in South Africa, there's been a big shift towards consideration of equal opportunities, equal rights, equal treatment, and so on. And I think that's, certainly in South Africa, is one of the big shifts that we've seen over the last 20 years or so. Yeah.
Then I guess the next round of questions that I would like to put to the panel is sort of where do you see the big point to push on now? I mean, as a project, what Counting Women's Work is focused on now is just sort of publishing the research in a way that gets it more notice and makes people aware that these estimates are out there and useful, and also to kind of start publishing comparative sort of scorecards on things that can be used to understand the different phenomena and different patterns, and points at which there are certain kinds of inequality that might be addressed by certain kinds of policies. So then, and also to Mornay and Pamela, sort of what's next for the project in your countries, and then for Ileana and Nancy, sort of what is your big move in the future of unpaid care work? So I'll go back in the same order and start with Pamela on that, if we could.
Okay, so right now in the project, we're trying to try to publish a lot of our results, try to connect a lot with policymakers. We've completed most of our the estimations of the project, but right now we're trying to do more of the simulations part. What if female labor force participation increase? What if things? I think what we're going to work next is try to do some comparison with some Nordic countries or some European countries that have better parenting leaves policies, for example, just to try to be more clear when we're talking to policymakers. When we compare, like, for example, this is Sweden and this is what they have and this is the distribution of time, see the difference that we don't have. And also we're working with what I mentioned before in this new national timing survey, because we only have a regional timing survey and we have a very, very small national timing survey, and this is all based because the Ministry for Women has proved to estimate satellite account household production. So we're working close with them, try to be sure that the questions that we need and that we think they're important to be included in the questionnaire, for example, like elderly care, for me, it's very important So to make this point, we show them, see, we don't see any elderly care right now, and I don't think it's not that it doesn't exist, is that it's very hard to capture, because a lot of people think that elderly care it's more like companion, and so it's very difficult to differentiate elderly care. So we're trying to work on this and discussing with the general controller to start a project with them with new estimations and try to deep a little bit more the analysis, especially in a fiscal, with a fiscal perspective, with the government situation and the impact it has, the national transfer accounts and the time use estimations of the fiscal finances.
Thank you. Renee, so what's going on in South Africa counting women's work for the rest of the year?
Right. So, I mean, I think that we've got sort of three big things that we would want to push on further. The first thing, I think, is to sort of understand what is driving some of the patterns that we're seeing. So, if we think of a labor income profile for men and for women, that's obviously sort of the net result of a whole lot of things that are going on. So it's going to be a result of differences in participation rates. It's going to be differences in employment rates, hours of work, occupational distributions, mean wages. So I think one of the things that we want to try and do is get a better grasp on what is driving specific changes across the age, across the life cycle, and try and get a better feel for what are sort of the big factors driving it at each point. I think obviously for South Africa, we're sort of getting to the end of the demographic dividend, and I think we really want to start considering what the situation will be as the population begins to age. And I think that's one of the big things that we want to start looking at, is to try and work out what is going to be the demand for household production and household care work as the population structure changes. And then also, what is the supply going to look like? So are we going to have to, what are the choices that we're going to face as a society, and whether are we going to have to say we want the market to pick up the deficit, or do we want the public sector to pick up the deficit, or are we going to say, well, look, we want households to bear that? So I think that's the one big, sort of the second big thing that we want to look at. And I think the last one sort of touches on a point that Pamela made as well, is the idea of, for us, is more dissemination, not just in South Africa, but within the region, because I think very few African countries actually have time use data. And so I think one of the good things that could come out of this, and something that we're trying to follow up on, is to try and get more interest in time use surveys, try and get governments more interested in financing the surveys and getting better data so that we can understand this in other countries. And I think that's sort of the big thing. So South Africa has also just gone into the field with a new time use survey. So we're excited to get some new data at some point too.
All right, thank you very much. So Nancy, what's on your immediate to-do list besides 10 million things?
Well, one thing I thought I would mention is that I've become more engaged with the International Association for Research on Income and Wealth, which is, I think, a very interesting group because it brings together academics and people who are working in national statistical offices. And I think whatever we can do to bring more research on time use into that venue would really serve us well, because it sort of reaches the group of people who are actively involved in survey design and survey administration, who I think could be really important allies in this whole effort. So I'm trying to be kind of a point person for people who are doing research that might be appropriate for those meetings. They happen every 2 years. So I want I really want to encourage people to get more involved with that. I also work a lot with the International Association for Feminist Economics, and that has been a very good platform. Especially the journal has published a lot of research on unpaid work and gender inequality, and I think that's a great opportunity for people.
So it looks like we might have lost Gretchen, but Eliana, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, so we'll be working hard to compile as much information as possible on family policies across developing countries. As I said, around the dimensions of coverage, institutional arrangements, quality, and financing on the one hand. And then on the other hand, I also wanted to mention that my colleagues in the data group at the bank, they are working on some experimentation on employment and time use. The first one on employment, so we have a partnership with the Hewlett Foundation, ILO, and FAO, and Data2X to implement a new definition of work. And the new definition, as you probably know, makes a clear distinction between employment, which generates paid income for the household, and work, which includes unpaid activities such as care and household production, let's say. So the change will have important implications for information on the type of activities that women undertake. So we are conducting some experiments. So we already did one in Ghana, and the second one will be conducted in Malawi to implement this new definition. And the second one is the bank is also running some household survey experiments on time use to test the traditional recall and diary-based methods with hybrid approaches that will also consider the use of commercial activity trackers, such as GPS trackers, let's say, that could provide also data on the type, duration, as well as intensity of physical activities.
Okay, sorry for disappearing. The internet gods did not smile on me for a moment there. So we've come to the end of the hour, and let me thank the panelists for joining us. Thank you so much, and also thank everybody who has tuned in to listen. The recording of this will be available through our project website and the YouTube channel, and we'll let you know when we get together again next. Hangout hopefully will be more focused on specific results from the project. So, and look for that in another couple of months. Thanks very much, and have a great day, everybody.